Dear Professor Sir Martin Rees, dear participants, dear colleagues and friends, a very warm welcome everyone. Welcome to the online Scientific Turkey public lecture series of TÜBİTAK Research Institute for Fundamental Sciences, which will organize relying on the unifying feature of science in a unique intellectual space, which will organize with the aim of sharing the passion for science and research, the power and wonder of science with a wide audience, as well as fostering scientific curiosity and science culture in the society. Now it is my distinct pleasure and honor to let you know that this evening we have very special speaker, Professor Sir Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal in the United Kingdom, one of the world's great minds in astrophysics and cosmology, as well as in the existential risks that face us on the Earth. Professor Sir Martin Rees has kindly agreed to join us for this seminar, and he is going to give a great talk about the world in 2050 and beyond. Yes. Professor Martin Rees is based at the University of Cambridge, where he has served at the highest level of science in many prominent roles. As director of the Institute of Astronomy for 10 years, Royal Society Research Professor from 1992 to 2003, and then Master of Trinity College between 2004 to 12. In 2005, Professor Martin Rees was appointed to the House of Lords, and he was president of the Royal Society for the period 2005 to 10. Professor Martin Rees' main research interests are high energy astrophysics, especially gamma ray bursts, galactic nuclei, black hole formation, cosmic structure formation, especially the early generation of stars and galaxies that formed at high redshift at the end of the cosmic dark age. His scientific career includes many pioneering research. In particular, he was one of the first to propose that enormous black holes power quasars and that superluminal astronomical observations can be explained as an optical illusion caused by an object moving partly in the direction of the observer. Professor Martin Rees is the author and co-author of more than 500 research papers, as well as 10 books, most recently, on the future prospect for humanity. He's also one of the world's most recognized voices on existential risk on global issues such as the pressures that a growing and more demanding population are placing on environment, sustainability, and biodiversity, and the impact of powerful new technologies. He is co-founder of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, with a focus on these issues. Professor Martin Rees is a foreign associate and honorary member of many world academies, which were not able to recount here. Professor Martin Rees has received numerous awards, including the Gold Medal of the Royal Astronomical Society, Gruber Prize in Cosmology, Einstein Award for World Cultural Council, Michael Faraday Prize, Isaac Newton Medal, Niels Bohr Medal from UNESCO, Dirac Medal and Prize from ICTP, and many others. We need to think globally. We need to think rationally. We need to think long-term, empowered by 21st century technology, but guided by values that science alone cannot provide, says Professor Sir Martin Rees. It remains only to thank him for this. With this, I want to thank once again Professor Sir Martin Rees for joining us this evening. Martin, we are extremely honored to have you with us. You are welcome to begin your talk, please.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you. I'm sorry I'm not with you in person, but good evening, everyone who is listening. Let me try to share my screen. Just a minute. So, sorry about this. I'm having some problems. Yes. Yes. Can you see? That's all right. Okay. Yes. Sorry about the problem. Let me just say first that I'm going to give a very broad and general talk, and I should first say that although I have the title Astronomer Royal, the Queen does not ask me for horoscopes. In fact, I'm an astronomer, not an astrologer, and scientists are not very good as forecasters. All I would say is that they are rather better than economists. But despite all that, I did write a book entitled On the Future, and I will make some forecasts, but they're going to be rather tentative, especially in front of an audience where there are probably better experts than me. The theme of my talk is that this century is special. It's the first in the 45 million centuries of Earth's history when the main threats come not from nature, but from one species, our species, which has a long-term future in its hands. We're deep in what's called the Anthropocene. But let's start off by focusing on two things that we can predict, even with a cloudy crystal ball. First, the world in 2050 will be more crowded. 50 years ago, the world population was below 4 billion. It's now about 7.8 billion. And the growth has been mainly in Asia and Africa. And this distorted map gives each country a size proportional to the growth in population there in the last 30 years. And as you can see, the growth has been mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and in East Asia. The number of births per year worldwide is actually not going up anymore. Nonetheless, the world population is forecast to increase to about 9 billion by the middle of the century. That's mainly because most people in the developing world are young and they're yet to have children and they live longer. The histogram on the left, which shows the age distribution of men and women in West Africa, will become more like that on the right, which is the situation in Europe, because all the young people in West Africa, they'll have longer lives than their predecessors did. And despite doom-laden forecasts that were made by the Club of Rome and other bodies 50 years ago, food production has kept pace with the doubling population in the last 50 years. Famines still occur, but they're due to conflict or maldistribution, not overall scarcity. But to feed 9 billion by mid-century will require further improved agriculture, water conserving and GM crops, and maybe dietary innovation, converting insects and maggots, highly nutritious and rich in proteins, into palatable food, and making artificial meat. But to quote Gandhi, there'll be enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Projections beyond 2050 are uncertain. Falling infant mortality, urbanization, and women's education will trigger the demographic transition towards lower birth rates. But there could be countervailing cultural influences. If, for whatever reason, families in Africa remain large, then according to the United Nations projections, that continent's population could double again between 2050 and 2100 to 4 billion, thereby raising the global population to 11 billion. And Nigeria alone would then have nearly as big a population as Western Europe and North America combined. Well, optimists say that each extra mouth brings two hands and a brain. But it's the geopolitical stresses that are most worrying. As compared to the fatalism of earlier generations, those in poor countries now know via the internet, etc., what they're missing. And migration is easier. So it's a portent for disaffection and instability. Multiple megaversions of the tragic boat people crossing the Mediterranean today, if we can't ensure that Africa keeps up with the rest of the world. So wealthy nations, especially those in Europe, should urgently instigate a sort of mega Marshall Plan for Africa, and not just for altruistic reasons. And another thing, if humanity's collective impact on land use and climate pushes too hard, the resulting ecological shock could irreversibly impoverish our biosphere. Extinction rates are rising. We're destroying the book of life before we've read it. Already there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows, and domestic animals is 20 times that in wild mammals. Biodiversity is crucial for human well-being. But preserving the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above what it means to us humans. To quote the great Harvard ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. So the world's getting more crowded. And as a second firm prediction, it's getting warmer. In contrast to population trends, climate change is certainly not under-discussed, though it is still under-acted upon. The basic fact is in this picture. This shows measurements of the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere made over the last 60 years. You can see the rise, and incidentally, the oscillations by year are because there are more trees in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere. So in the northern autumn, when the leaves fall off the trees, that gives a rise in CO2, which is sucked in again when the leaves grow in the spring. But the main thing is this rising trend, and CO2 is a greenhouse gas, so this leads to warming. And the fifth IPCC presented a spread of projections of what the temperature would do later this century under various assumptions about how much fossil fuels we continue to use in future. I won't go into the separate scenarios, but there's a big range. And I'd also draw attention to the bars on the right-hand side of this picture, because they are the uncertainties. Because even though we understand the effect of carbon dioxide on the climate, we don't understand the secondary feedback effects. For instance, if water vapor changes and cloud cover changes, that will also affect things, and those are the uncertainties in the present projections. And in fact, this is not the most up-to-date. The need for urgent action was highlighted in an update which the IPCC published in 2018. But despite the uncertainties, there's one message that most would agree on, which is that under business as usual, we can't rule out later this century really catastrophic long-term trends, like the melting of Greenland's ice cap. that's the situation we are in if we go on business as usual. It's like the proverbial boiling frog, contented in a warming tank until it's too late to save itself. And of course, it's nations far away from us in Europe that will suffer most from climate change. The Danish campaigner Born Lomborg, he has sort of bogeyman status among environmentalists, which is a bit unfair because he doesn't contest the science. But his Copenhagen consensus of economists downplays the importance of addressing climate change compared to shorter-term ways of helping the world's poor. But that's because he applies a standard discount rate and in effect more or less writes off what happens more than 30 years ahead. But economists who care about what will live, or those people who will live into the 22nd century and beyond, economists like Stern and Weitzman, they argue that we should deem it worth paying an insurance premium now to safeguard against the worst case. And I think most of us subjectively do apply a very small discount rate in this case because we care what the world will be like when our children and grandchildren grow old. And children born today will live into the first part of the 22nd century. So we ought to care about the world we're leaving for them. And unsurprisingly, it's the young, those who expect to live to the end of the century, whose clamour for action is loudest. And their leverage on voters and the media has been amplified in the last year or two. And so climate issues are high on the agenda, and especially important have been the rather diverse quartet of Pope Francis, David Attenborough, Bill Gates, and Greta Thunberg. These people have energized the public to demonstrate and care about climate change. And of course, unless the public is energized and voters support these changes, then politicians won't respond. Politicians will focus on the near term and the local rather than on what happens in distant parts of the world 30 years from now, unless they know the public supports them. And there are crucial meetings this year on these issues. There's a meeting in Glasgow on climate. This is the 26th meeting of the IPCC, and there's a meeting in October at Konyang in China on biodiversity, which is going to ensure that we don't destroy the rainforests and things like that. So this is a key year for safeguarding the long-term future of our biosphere. But let me insert a bit of good cheer. There is a win-win roadmap to a low-carbon future. Nations with a strong research base should accelerate research and development into all forms of low-carbon energy generation and into other technologies where we need parallel progress, especially energy storage, batteries, hydrogen, compressed air, etc., and also into smart transcontinental grids. And this should enable Europe and North America to reach net zero. But even more important is what this could do for the rest of the world. The faster these clean energy technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall, so they will become affordable to the nations of the global south. And these nations, I'm thinking of India and sub-Saharan Africa, they can't reach acceptable living standards without generating more power than they do today. Not only will their per capita energy needs rise, unlike those in our countries, but they will collectively harbour 1 billion more people by 2050. So, as it were, bending the trajectory of CO2 emissions from those countries is crucial. They will then be able to leapfrog more speedily to clean energy if they can afford it, rather than building coal-fired power stations, just as those countries have leapfrogged directly to smartphones and never had landline telephones. And it'll be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers in our countries than devising clean and economical energy systems which can achieve net zero for the world. We should be evangelists for new technologies. Without it, the world can't provide food and sustainable energy for an expanding and more demanding population. Indeed, many are anxious that some technologies are advancing so fast that we can't properly cope with them, and that we'll therefore have a rather bumpy ride through the century. Nuclear war still looms over us. The only consolation is that there are now about 5 times fewer weapons and on lower alert than the US and Russia deployed during the Cold War. But there are now 9 nuclear powers, and a higher chance than ever that smaller nuclear arsenals might be used regionally, or even by terrorists. And some claim, incidentally, that the command and control systems for nuclear weapons are getting more vulnerable to cyber threats. Moreover, we can't rule out later in the century the standoff between new superpowers, which could be handled less well or less luckily than, for instance, the Cuba crisis was in the 1960s. Nuclear weapons are 20th century technology, but this century has brought surges in new technologies: bio, cyber, and AI. First, a few words on biotech. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics offer prospects for containing natural pandemics. But the same research raises, and this is my number one fear, the prospect of engineered pandemics. Here's the influenza virus. And back in 2012, 2 research groups, one in the United States, the other in Holland, showed it was surprisingly easy to make this virus both more virulent and more transmissible. To some, this was a scary portent of things to come. And these so-called gain-of-function experiments can be done in principle for coronaviruses. And the new CRISPR-Cas9 technique for gene editing is hugely promising, but it raises ethical concerns about experiments on human embryos, for instance, and worries about possible runaway consequences of gene drive programs to wipe out species as diverse as mosquitoes on the left, or even grey squirrels, a small mammal which is regarded as rather a pest in my country, although I think it's rather nice. Regulation of biotech is needed, but I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed on prudential or ethical grounds can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws. I worry that whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that is a nightmare, because whereas an atom bomb can't be built without large-scale special purpose facilities which can be monitored, biotech involves small-scale dual-use equipment, which you can find in university labs or industrial labs. And the rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups, or even individuals empowered by biotech, and indeed by cybertech as well, will pose an intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between 3 things we surely all want to preserve. One is privacy, the other's freedom, and the other's security. Because the global village will have its village idiots, and their idiocies can now cascade globally. So powerful is technology. These concerns are fairly near term, within 10 or 15 years. What about looking further ahead? On the bio front, we might expect 2 things. First, a better understanding of the combination of genes which determine key human characteristics, and the ability to synthesize genomes which match these features. If it becomes possible for biohackers to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, our ecology and even our species may not long survive unscathed. But what about another transformative technology? Robotics and artificial intelligence, AI. DeepMind's AlphaGo Zero computer famously beats human champions in the games of Go and chess. It was just given the rules and trained by playing millions of games against itself in just a few hours. But the human challenger who was beaten, Mr. Loqui, he has a brain which thinks far more slowly than these computers. That's why he lost. But he has some advantages. The computer used hundreds of kilowatts of electricity. His brain uses about 30 watts, just like one light bulb. And he could do many other things apart from just playing games. So humans have many advantages still over computers. But already AI is gaining, and that's because of its ever-rising processing speed. This picture shows the consequence of what's called Moore's law, the increase in the speed of computers over the last 50 years, really, but particularly in the recent decade. And already AI, because of its ever-rising processing speed, can cope better than humans with complex, fast-changing networks. Traffic flows in a city, for instance, or electric grids in a country. And to take another example, the Chinese could, if they wished, have an efficient planned economy that Marx could only dream of, because they can monitor all transactions and the stock in every shop and warehouse and process that data in real time. But AI can help science too. It can understand the process called protein folding, help with drug development, and perhaps even settle for us physicists whether string theory can really describe our universe, because the maths may be just too hard for a human being to do in a human lifetime. The implications of all this for our society are already a bit ambivalent. If we're sentenced to a term in prison, recommended for surgery, or even given a poor credit rating by a bank, we'd expect the reasons to be accessible to us and contestable by us. But if these decisions were entirely delegated to some algorithm, we'd be entitled to feel uneasy, even if presented with compelling evidence that on average, the machines make better decisions than the humans they've usurped. And AI systems will become more intrusive and more pervasive. Records of all our movements, our health and our financial transactions will be in the cloud, managed by a multinational quasi-monopoly. The data may be used for benign purposes, for instance, for medical research, or to warn us of incipient health risks, but its availability to internet companies is already shifting the balance of power from governments to globe-spanning conglomerates. And there are big changes coming in the nature of work. And these have been addressed in several good books by economists and social scientists. Clearly, machines will take over much of manufacturing and retail distribution, and they can supplement, if not replace, many white-collar jobs, routine legal work, accountancy, computer coding, medical diagnostics, and even surgery. They can help doctors and surgeons with their work. In contrast, some skilled service sector jobs, like plumbing and gardening, require such non-routine interactions with the external world that they'd be very, very hard to automate. They bewilder a robot. And indeed, incidentally, to create a humane society, I think governments will need to vastly enhance the number of and status of those who care for the old, the young, and the sick. These are jobs which are hard to mechanize, and they're currently far too few. And people doing them are poorly paid, poorly esteemed, and insecure in their positions in most countries. It's far more fulfilling work, far more fulfilling than work in call centers or Amazon warehouses. So what should happen is that companies like Amazon should be taxed, and the money raised should be used to re-employ the workers from call centers and warehouses in more caring human professions. There'll be other privacy concerns from AI. Are you happy, for instance, if a random stranger sitting near you on a bus or train can, by facial recognition, identify you and invade your privacy. Or if fake videos become so convincing that visual evidence can no longer be trusted, and the against them will become still more expensive and vexatious. Ethical tensions are already emerging when AI moves from the research phase to being a potentially massive money spinner for global companies. And of course, it's the speed of the computers which allows them to learn on big training sets. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images, not the way babies learn. They learn to translate by reading millions of pages of multilingual text. In Europe, they're given European Union documents. Their boredom threshold is infinite. But acquiring common sense won't be so easy for AI and robots, because that involves observing real people in real homes or workplaces. And a machine will be sensorily deprived by the slowness of real life. It's like watching trees grow is for us. So it's not easy to ensure that robots get common sense. And also, they are still clumsier than a child in moving pieces on a real chessboard. They can't jump from tree to tree like a monkey or a squirrel. But sensor technology is advancing fast, and this may happen. And this leads me to a digression. It's always harder to forecast the speed of technological changes than their direction. Sometimes there's a spell of very fast progress, like the spread of IT and smartphones in the last decade or two. But then there's an inflection or even stagnation. Let me give two examples. Alcock and Brown made the first transatlantic flight in 1919. The first jumbo jet flew across the Atlantic 50 years later, in 1969. But 50 years later now, we still have the jumbo jet, and Concorde came and went in the meantime. So civil aviation developed fast for 50 years and then was steady for the next 50. And another example, it was only 12 years from Sputnik 1 in 1957 to the moon landings. But 50 years later, the Apollo program is still the high point of human spaceflight. And incidentally, experts are getting less optimistic about how quickly fully driverless cars will become acceptable. And the iPhone 20 may not be all that different from the iPhone 12. But let's look still further ahead. What if a machine developed a mind of its own? Would it stay docile or go rogue? Futuristic books portray a dark side where AI gets out of its box, infiltrates the Internet of Things, and pursues goals misaligned or even hostile to human interest. Some AI pundits take this seriously, but others, like for instance Rodney Brooks, the inventor of the Baxter robot, regard these concerns as premature, and they think it'll be a long time before artificial intelligence need worry us more than real stupidity does. But be that as it may, it's likely that society will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on whether they'll be idiot savants or display superhuman capabilities, and whether we should worry more about breakdowns and bugs or about being outsmarted. This is the futurologist Ray Kurzweil, who now works for Google. And he argues that once machines have surpassed human capabilities, they could themselves design and assemble a new generation of even more powerful ones. It'd be an intelligence explosion. He wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines, where he predicted that humans would transcend biology by merging with computers. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. But Kurzweil is worried that this nirvana may not happen in his lifetime. So he wants to be preserved in liquid nitrogen until that time is reached. And there's a company in the United States, in Arizona, that will freeze and store your body, claiming that when immortality is on offer, you can be resurrected or your brain downloaded into something electronic. I was surprised to find that 3 academics here in England had gone in for this so-called cryonics. 2 paid the full whack. The third took the cut price option of just wanting his head frozen. I was glad that they were all from Oxford and not from my university, Cambridge. And I told them I'd rather end my days in an English churchyard than in an American refrigerator. But of course, research on aging is being seriously prioritized. So will the benefits be incremental, or is aging a disease that can be cured? Dramatic life extension will plainly be a real wild card in population projections, with huge social ramifications. But it may happen, along with human enhancements in other forms. It's surely on the cards that human beings, their mentality and their physique, may become changeable through the deployment of genetic modification and cyborg technologies. Designer babies will then become conceivable in both senses of the word. Moreover, this future evolution, a kind of secular intelligent design, would take only centuries, in contrast to the thousands of centuries needed for Darwinian evolution. And this is a game changer. When we admire the literature and artifacts which have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity across a time gulf of thousands of years with those ancient artists and their civilizations. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries in the future will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have some algorithmic understanding of how we behaved. And now I turn to another technology, space, which is my special interest, because it's beyond our Earth, in environments hostile to humans, that cyborgs, robots, and AI technologies have the most spectacular scope, and where these changes will happen fastest and should worry us least. During this century, the whole solar system will be explored by swarms of miniaturized probes, far more advanced than the wonderful Cassini probe, which spent 13 years exploring Saturn and its moons, or the New Horizon probe, which transmitted back to Earth amazing pictures from Pluto, 12,000 times further away from us than the moon is. Think back to the computers and phones of the 1990s, which is when these probes were designed. They were designed then because it takes 5 years to build them, and then they took more than 10 years on their journey to their destination. And if you realize how things have advanced in the last 20 years, just realize how much better we could do designing probes of the outer solar system today. The next step will be the deployment in space of robotic fabricators, which can build large structures, for instance, giant telescopes or solar energy collectors, which can be assembled under zero gravity. But what about human spaceflight? I think the practical need for sending humans gets weaker all the time as robots get better and as miniaturization gets better. So will, despite that, human spaceflight have a resurgence, because it's very expensive as well. I cherish this picture signed for me a few years ago by 7 of the Apollo astronauts. And it's nearly 50 years since 2 people, Schmidt and Kernan, the last 2 men on the moon, returned to Earth, having grabbed about 100 kilograms of moon samples to bring back with them. Hundreds more have been into space subsequently, but they've done no more than circle the Earth in low orbit, mainly in the International Space Station. And this is very unglamorous compared to going to the moon. And indeed, they only make news when something goes wrong. When a toilet fails, for instance, or when they perform stunts, like the Canadian Chris Hadfield, who played the guitar and sang David Bowie songs. So will there be inspirational Apollo-style projects with people? This is the Perseverance probe, which landed on Mars a few weeks ago and is going to be trundling around Martian craters trying to analyze the soil. And there's no denying that this, which is the most advanced probe on the moon now, on Mars now, will miss many startling discoveries that no human geologist could overlook. But machine learning is advancing fast, and so is sensor technology. So future robotic probes like this may be able to do geology as well as a human. And of course, the cost gap between sending humans and sending robots remains huge, especially on a long voyage like to Mars, when you have to provide food and support for a year or so for the humans. NASA's manned program, ever since Apollo, has been impeded by public and political pressure into being very risk averse. The space shuttle, which took people to the space station, failed twice in 135 launches. That's less than 2% failure rate. And astronauts or test pilots would willingly accept this 2% level of risk. But the shuttle had unwisely been promoted as though it was safe for civilians. And each of these failures was then a trauma for the Americans. And I think because of this safety culture, NASA will confront political obstacles in achieving any grand goal within a feasible budget. And I think as a European, that it would be wise if the European Space Agency didn't get involved in a big way in manned spaceflight, but stuck to robotics for Earth-oriented missions and scientific missions to space. And were I an American, I would strongly support NASA's robotic programs, but I'd argue that all human missions, if they're done at all, should be private enterprise ventures done by Elon Musk's SpaceX or Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin company, because they can operate a cut price program with the acceptance of far higher risks than Western nations could impose on publicly supported civilians. And there'll still be many volunteers, some perhaps even accepting one-way tickets to Mars, driven by the same motives as early explorers, mountaineers, and the like. So I think the first people to land on Mars will be adventurers sent by one of these private companies. Incidentally, the phrase space tourism should be avoided because it lulls people into believing that these ventures are routine and low risk. And if that's the perception, then the inevitable accidents will be as traumatic as those of the space shuttle were. These must be sold as dangerous sports, intrepid exploration. But by the end of this century, by 2100, courageous thrill seekers may have established bases independent from the Earth, on Mars or maybe on asteroids. Elon Musk himself, who's nearly 50, says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. He might manage that 40 years from now. But don't ever expect mass emigration from Earth. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. And here I disagree with Musk and my late colleague Stephen Hawking. It's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from Earth's problems. Dealing with climate change on Earth is hard, but it's simple compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. Nonetheless, we should cheer on any brave space adventurers who go to Mars because they have a pivotal role in spearheading what I call the post-human future in the 22nd century and beyond. And this is why. they'll be ill-adapted to their new habitat. So they'll have a compelling incentive, more so than we do on Earth, to redesign themselves. They'll harness the super powerful genetic and cyborg technologies that will be developed in coming decades. And these techniques, we hope, will be regulated and restrained here on Earth on prudential grounds and ethical grounds. But the settlers on Mars would be beyond the clutches of the regulators. And we should surely wish them good luck as pioneers in modifying their progeny to adapt to a hostile environment. So it's these spacefaring pioneers, not those of us comfortably adapted to life on Earth, who will spearhead the post-human era that Kurzweil envisages. I'm often asked, do astronomers bring a special perspective to these questions and to global issues like those I'm talking about? Let me explain why I think they do. We're all familiar, I think, with this time chart, which depicts evolution on Earth, whereby over nearly 4 billion years, the simplest forms of life, whose origins are still mysterious, evolved by Darwinian selection into the complex biosphere we have today and of which we're a part. That's taken 4 billion years. But many people, even though accepting this, think somehow that we humans are the culmination of it, that we're the top of the tree. I don't think any astronomer can believe that. And the reason for that is that the sun has been shining for 4.5 billion years, but it's got 6 billion more years to go. And the universe will go on far longer still, maybe forever. And to quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So we may be nearer the beginning than the end of the emergence of complexity in the universe. They'd be brains quite different from ours. We have no idea what they will be, but we just don't know. But of course, this then comes to another question, which I'm asked as an astronomer. Is there life out there already? Or is the galaxy awaiting our post-human descendants who may be near immortal and can make interstellar voyages? This is, as I said, the question that we're all asked as astronomers, but we all agree that we don't know. Well, not all. I get letters from people who think they've met the aliens, been abducted by them, etc. I tell them, would the aliens make the big effort to come here, just meet one or two crazy people, and then go away again? It seems unlikely. I tell these people to write to each other and not to me. But it's a serious question. There may be life out there. And we can say that in our solar system, there's possibly simple life. On the red planet Mars, of course, the probe that I just showed is looking for evidence of simple life. And there might be some life under the ice of this Enceladus, which is a moon of Saturn. But no one expects any very complicated life here on Earth, here in our solar system. But if we widen our horizons to the realm of the stars, things are very different, because we've learnt that most stars in the sky are orbited by retinues of planets. They're suns and they have planets around them. And we know that there are billions of stars in the sky which in the far future could develop life or may already have done so. I could make a separate lecture on this topic, but it's very exciting to look for evidence of life on these planets around other stars, vegetation on those planets, or better still, intelligent life. This picture, which I should have shown earlier, this shows the time chart for the past, but indicates that the far future is much longer. But let's now come back to Earth. Let's realize that this present century, even in this time span here, stretching billions of years into the past and into the future, this century is special because it's the first century when one species, as I said at the beginning, can determine the universe's fate, the Earth's fate, and the fate of life. We could either jumpstart evolution, which could spread far beyond the Earth, or we could trigger cyber, or environmental catastrophes, which could foreclose all the options of post-human evolution. But what should be our message to the younger generation? It should be this. It's that 21st century technology should allow us to offer a good life even to 9 billion people. But what's hard is the politics and the sociology. So we can be technical optimists, but the intractable politics and sociology engender pessimism. The scenarios I've described, environmental degradation, unchecked climate change, and unintended consequences of advanced technology, could trigger catastrophic setbacks to our society. And our world is now so interconnected that a collapse, societal or ecological, would be a truly global setback. And given the stakes, these threats shouldn't be ignored. We should be mindful of the American journalist Nate Silver's maxim, the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. And I think scientists have an obligation to promote beneficial applications of their work and also to warn against the downsides. Universities should offer their staff's expertise and convening power to assess which risks can be dismissed as science fiction and how best to avoid the serious ones. And we in Cambridge have in fact set up a centre to address these issues of extreme risks. And most of these challenges are indeed global. Coping with COVID-19 plainly is. And the threats of potential shortages of food, water, and natural resources can't be solved by each nation separately, nor can going carbon free, nor can the regulation of potentially threatening innovations. Indeed, a key issue, I think, is whether in a new world order, we're going to have to give up more national sovereignty to new organizations along the lines of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, and similar. Now, I'm going to finish off with a flashback by several centuries. This is Ely Cathedral, just 10 miles from where I live in England. I could have shown a great mosque or any other ancient beautiful building. But the point I make is that this dates from the Middle Ages when for medieval people, the entire cosmology from creation to apocalypse spanned only a few thousand years. They were bewildered and helpless in the face of floods and pestilences, and they were prone to irrational dread, and they only knew a small part of the earth. But they built cathedrals, constructed with primitive technology by masons who knew they probably wouldn't live to see them finished. These vast and glorious religious buildings, which we have and you have, and that still inspire us centuries later. Our horizons today, in space and time, are vastly extended, as are our resources and knowledge, but we don't plan centuries ahead. And this seems a paradox, but there is a reason. Medieval lives played out against a backdrop that changed little from one generation to the next. They may have thought the world would end in 1,000 years, but they thought their children and grandchildren would have lives like theirs, and they'd appreciate the finished cathedral. But for us, unlike for them, the next century will be drastically different from the present. We can't foresee it, so it's harder to plan for it. There's now a big disjunction between the ever-shortening timescale of social and technical change and the billion-year timescales of biology, geology, and cosmology. So, spaceship Earth is a picture of the Earth and the Moon, taken from halfway to Mars. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious, and their life support system is vulnerable. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning. But this pale blue dot in the cosmos is a special place. It may be a unique place if there's no life out there already, and we're its stewards at a especially crucial era. And that's an important message for us all. We need to think globally, we need to think rationally, we need to think long term. We need to be, as it were, good ancestors, empowered by 21st century technology, but guided by values that science itself can't provide. So thank you very much for listening to this talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very exciting and comprehensive talk.
Right. Good.
Can we now pass to questions?
Yes, and I will try to end my screen sharing. Right. Yes. Okay.
So first question is, as we all know, the pandemic did come as a shockwave for which the nation were underprepared.
Yes. As
a result, COVID-19 has had an enormous effect globally. Will you please elaborate more on a global foresight perspectives and important scientific, sociological, and political actions after the end of the pandemic?
Yes. Well, it's true that the pandemic should be a wake-up call, which does ensure that we do prepare for future pandemics. We must prepare for anything exactly like what we have now. Something unexpected may occur. But I think if we look back, we have this pandemic which has spread globally, and some estimates say that over the next few years, it will cost the world something like $20 trillion, as well as killing millions and blighting the lives of many more millions. In that perspective, it would be worth spending many hundreds of billions of dollars in preparation as a sort of insurance premium, because no one could have said that a coronavirus pandemic was unlikely. Within the last 20 years, we'd had SARS and MERS in Asia, and they hadn't spread catastrophically. But we clearly should have spread. We should have prepared more, and for instance, be more prepared to make vaccines even quicker, and have protective clothing for everyone, etc. So I think we've learned the lesson that it's important that we should prepare more. And of course, the other point is that it's always said that no one is safe until everyone is safe, because the pandemic can spread across the world. And one hopes it will perhaps encourage international collaboration, the strengthened World Health Authority, in order to ensure that we can get vaccines more quickly to all parts of the world, not just some countries, and also to actually catch a potential pandemic before it gets started, when it's still at the on the wet market in China, or among the pigs of a Vietnamese farmer or something like that. If you can actually monitor so as you catch it early, then you will save billions or even trillions of dollars. So I think there will be a plan to actually deal with future pandemics rather better. But of course, we've got to bear in mind that we shouldn't sort of refight the last war. The next big global catastrophe may be rather different from pandemics. So we've got to have resilience. And I think, incidentally, one thing we have learned is that resilience is more important than efficiency. Let me give two examples. First, it's good to keep some spare capacity in hospitals for an emergency. It's efficient to keep all the beds full all the time, but it's good, as the Germans did, but most other countries didn't, to keep some fraction of the beds free for an emergency. And also, it's economical to depend on supply chains across the world and depend on just-in-time delivery. But of course, that makes you vulnerable, because if one link in the chain breaks, then that may have a big effect on manufacturing. in a large sector. So it makes more sense to keep an infantry in stock and to have multiple supply chains. So that's a case where it's worth tolerating a bit of inefficiency in order to be resilient. So I could go on for longer, but that's first thoughts.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
Another question says, assuming that there is an intelligent life in distant stars, and known that they could have existed for millions of years, is there a reason why they could not acquire the technology to contact us?
Well, of course, they could have done, and of course, there are programs to look for them. Some people say that they would have come and visited us, and the fact that they haven't means they don't exist. But I'd like to query that, and let me give an example, because I mentioned the 4 billion years of biological evolution that's led to us. But if you think of the next 4 billion years, it's going to be electronic entities. It's not going to be Darwinian selection. It's going to be electronic entities which may design better ones themselves. And Darwinian evolution favors two things. It favors intelligence, but it also favors aggression. But this future evolution won't favor aggression. So if the analog of post-humans are electronic entities, they may be living contemplative lives and not wanting to travel or expand. So the fact that we don't see any evidence or detect any signals doesn't mean they're not there, because it could be that the more advanced forms just think deep thoughts and don't need to explore.
Thank you. Another questions, Adam thanks you, saying that, dear Professor Rees, first of all, I would like to thank you for this very nice and interesting talk. I have a couple of small questions. If strong ethical regulation cannot stop the misuse of biotechnology and AL research, then what further actions should be taken to stop them? It seems that human, intentionally or not intentionally, damages the nature. Then what could be done to rescue plan of humanity?
Yes. Well, I think 2 points. One is there are some issues like climate change and avoiding mass extinctions, which require collective action. And here, I think we've got to have more people like Pope Francis and David Attenborough, etc., so that the public is sensitized to these issues, and politicians then do support the actions which are needed to preserve our environment for future generations. That's one thing. But then the other bigger worry for me is the misuse of powerful technologies, whereby a small number of people can cause a cyber attack which shuts down the electric grid in a whole country, or they can release a virus that makes a pandemic. And here I think this is a real problem, because it is only possible to guard against this if you really watch everyone all the time. And so, as I mentioned briefly, there's going to be a tension between three things we want: privacy, security, and freedom. And I think we're going to have to accept that we've got to agree to being watched all the time in order to avoid some ill-intended people doing something that could be catastrophic. We can't afford even one person to release a virus like COVID-19. And so I think I think we will have to accept the more intrusive surveillance, which I guess the Chinese will be happier to accept than we would. But I think we're going to have to tilt our balance between being more willing to accept that. Otherwise, we can't avoid this. And another way to express my worry is that there are lots of regulations international on biological ethics and all that, agreed by academies, etc. But enforcing them is as hard as enforcing the drug laws or the tax laws. And neither of those can be done very well. So I do worry that unless we have surveillance, then someone somewhere is going to do these things which are not merely unethical, but very dangerous. So I'm afraid I can't give a very optimistic answer to that. I think that's going to be the big challenge for the next 50 years.
Yeah, sure. You have defined yourself as a technical optimist and a political pessimist.
Yes.
To some extent, there is a contradiction between these two. Can you please unpack more this view?
Well, not a contradiction. I mean, I'm a technical optimist in that I believe that even the technology we now have, if optimally applied, could provide a good life for all the people on this planet. If the wealth was distributed and if the technology focused on what was helpful to poor people rather than on what only relates to the rich. There's a huge gap between the way the world is and the way it could be with present technology. That's what I mean, because even present technology can make a good world for everyone. And the fact it isn't is a political failure. That's really what I meant.
Okay, thank you. What do you see as the main challenges to the future of scientific research and education? What is your vision and forecast for fundamental sciences in the next decades?
Yes. Okay. Well, I mean, let me say two things. First, science education is important for everyone, whether they're going to be scientists or not. The reason for that is that many of the decisions we have to take in democracy have a scientific dimension to them, whether it's health, energy, environment, transport, all these things. And if we want to have a proper debate that gets above just the level of slogans, then everyone has to have a feel for the outlines of science and also enough feeling for numbers so they can't be bamboozled by bad statistics and things like that. So that's why everyone needs some education in science. But of course, if we think of the sciences on the frontier, then I think it's clear that AI and genetics are going to advance very fast, and they're going to be very helpful. That AI can be helpful if it's properly deployed, and also I think we need genetics in order to grow food for everyone without encroaching too much on natural forests. We want to feed more people and feed them better without taking more land. We want to leave some land in its natural state. And so those are two examples where we need to have more science. And of course, to give everyone healthier lives. There are lots of diseases which we can't tackle yet. So I think there are all kinds of areas where we are going to need to make some progress. And the point I'd make is that in order to solve these particular problems, you can't head straight for the problem. You've got to understand the basic ideas. And that's why some of the science in universities is not directed to any particular problem, but it's the basis for lots of underlying applications. So we need to have science covering all the main areas, which then can be applied to real potential problems. But you often can't head directly for the goal. To give an example from history, President Nixon set up in about 1970, he threw a lot of money at trying to cure cancer. And he thought, well, he threw money at going to the moon, and people had got to the moon. So he thought that by sending that amount of money to the people working on cancer, it would be cured. But of course, that didn't happen. And the point was that in the case of going to the moon, it was clear what could be done. It was an engineering challenge, and they could solve it. But in the case of curing cancer, people then, and even probably now, don't know exactly what to do. But they've learned a huge amount about biology and cells and all that. But they can't tackle that big problem head on. And that's true of much of science. You've got to tackle each problem in a piecemeal way. You've got to be either a genius or a crank to think you can solve the big problems in one go.
Thank you. In the modern world, we are witnessing serious problems such as unemployment, malnutrition, illnesses, global warming, inequalities between nations, etc. What do you think? How will it change in the next decades?
Well, that's just exemplifying the failure of politics now, which leads to this huge gap between what could be done and what has been done. So I just hope that with a more educated public and more willingness to listen to inspirational figures, some religious figures, some people like David Attenborough, a sort of secular pope, people like that, and also to young people, then there will be pressure to take actions that will indeed minimize the obvious wickednesses of the present world. It's a big challenge, but one just hopes that things like COVID have indicated how vulnerable we are. We can't be complacent, and we need to think globally, not just for global health, but in order to ensure food supplies and ensure a benign climate for us all, etc. So I think these messages are getting through. I mean, on the climate front, I think even big business is now realizing that it has a responsibility to try and help to move towards zero carbon economy. And that's a big change in the last 2 or 3 years. So that indicates that things can move in the right direction. But it's a big challenge, and the politics is harder than the science.
Thank you. Indeed, you partially or completely answered this question. Nevertheless, there's one question again. What do you recommend to avoid short memory and be well prepared for the risk of future pandemics? Yes.
Well, I think I've discussed particular things that can be done to prepare for a future pandemic, but I think as regards short memories, I mean, I think it is an ethical issue, isn't it? And that's why I said we've got to be good ancestors, because we all know how much we benefited from the heritage left to us by past generations. And we should feel ashamed if our generation hands on to its successors a depleted and more dangerous world. And so I think we've got to try and raise awareness of this concern, and also simply make everyone realize that these things we worry about may not happen in the lifetime of people as old as me, but they will happen in the lifetime of young people today. And we ought to think at least to the end of a century in our planning, because all young people today can aspire to being alive at the beginning of the 22nd century. So it is a matter of long-term thinking and global thinking. And I think there are moves which are more positive in those directions. But here again, I think religious leaders can help, and also more visionary politicians can.
Thank you very much. And final questions. What changes in the public perception of science do you expect in the context of the pandemic or after it? What changes do you expect in the scientific policy of the countries, especially developing countries?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think it's clear that science has had a higher profile in the pandemic than ever before with the public, and certainly I don't know what it's been like in Turkey, but in Britain the government's chief scientific advisor and chief medical advisor have been on television almost every night commenting on what's happening, and so and they become respected figures. So I think the public has realized that expert knowledge has been helpful, and the creation of vaccines within a year is a great achievement. We don't have a vaccine for AIDS after 40 years, for instance, so it's a great achievement to have had this. So I think science has something to celebrate in this area, but I think we need to ensure that there are enough experts in all the areas where we need them. In clean energy, we need people who can understand how we can make more efficient solar energy and all the rest of it. And incidentally, although it's controversial, I think fourth generation nuclear should be considered as well. That's a bit controversial, but I think for a base load, when it's cold and no wind and no sun, then we're going to need something like nuclear. And so I think we need to explore all those technologies.
So thank you very much for coming, joining us, for your very deep and intriguing answer. If you don't mind, we can close here session. What do you think, Martin?
Fine. I'm very, very happy. I enjoy answering questions, but we've had a very nice session, and I'm very grateful for people who are staying to the end.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes,
thank you.
So thank you very much indeed for inviting me, and I really hope I can visit your institute for real sometime, and you must come to England sometime to see us.
We will be waiting for this, and personally, I look very forward for this.
Yes, okay. Because I think just to digress one final point, I mentioned the concern about helping the parts of the world where conditions are worse, and that includes the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, you're more at the sharp end of this than we are. And I really think that there's got to be sort of aid to ensure that in those countries they don't fall further behind, because it's not like 100 years ago where they didn't know what they were missing. They now know what's going on in our countries. They've got mobile phones and see TV, etc., and that's a recipe for massive disaffection and turbulence. So it's in our interests as well as in theirs to ensure that they don't fall behind. And they do have problems, because if you think of how the countries of East Asia benefited, they did cheap manufacturing, undercutting the cost of labor in Europe and North America. And that's how Taiwan, Vietnam, and places developed so fast. But that ladder's been now kicked away, because robots can do that kind of manufacturing. So the countries of the Middle East and Africa can't develop that way. They've got to have other ways in which they can avoid falling behind. And I think it's going to be very hard for them to do this without, in effect, some subsidies from richer countries. Just like after World War II, Europe was in such a mess that the American Marshall Aid was essential to putting it on its feet again. And so I think we do need to realize that our fates are linked, and unless all parts of the world are flourishing, then no parts can feel stable.
Yeah, thank you very much for this message. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah.
Right.
So goodbye.